What's up everyone and welcome back to another build video. This one will be for the Endbringer Rogue. It will be another duelist build and it's very similar to the first Frostfang one on the channel. Except instead of using a niche weapon, this one is pretty much perfected to be as efficient as possible, and it utilizes the best tools in the game to become what I believe is one of, if not the strongest rogue build in the game. I typically avoid using Garb of Kinship and Maw of the Black City on the channel, but for the sake of having some of the most powerful builds possible for each class, I will be using those in this build. If you're looking to steamroll the game from level 1 until the end, this is the build for you. This build gets extremely strong very quickly and gets you strong tools as early in the game as possible, eventually transitioning into a completely invincible killing machine. Now for the early game. In Character Creator, the Veil Jumpers are really the best faction for this build due to the increased critical damage. But as always, I advise you to play the faction you find the coolest. Rogue's early game in this game feels great, and really the only hard part of the game is pre-level 25 when you're running around with bargain bin equipment and mediocre abilities. So rogues having very strong tools make the game much easier, and this build does its best to get all of those tools for you to use. I advise for the early game and really the entire game to use the swords and just hipfire the bow for extra damage. Maybe sniping a barrier target every once in a while when you see fit. Rogues synergize very well with parrying and dodging, so do not be afraid to be up close, spam dodges, and try to parry every once in a while. Much like my older rogue videos, I still advise against parrying in the endgame because it's really hard, with the animations and particle effects going on. And this build just makes it obsolete in the endgame anyway. But it's much easier in the early game, and it can really help make the early levels easier. The primary spells in the early game will be Pilfer, Explosive Trap, and Lightning Flask. Pilfer is incredibly useful in the early game of this build, before you become invincible. It's basically like having an extra potion every 60 seconds. It does okay damage, applies bleed, detonates Overwhelm, and it will also generate momentum for you, with a passive we will get to shortly. This ability is really the jack of all trades. Next up, we acquire Lightning Flask. This will be our only momentum based ability in the early game, so you pretty much get to use it every time you can. And you will have it up quite a lot from the tools generating momentum for you. Lightning Flask is super strong. It deals good damage in a large area and the effect follows you around for a while, dealing even more damage. You can also use it to absolutely yeet enemies into the sky, off the planet, all the way to meet their maker. Lastly, we get to Explosive Trap. After you get this ability, you should start feeling super strong. You'll probably only be about level 12, and from here on out, your build is just going to continue skyrocketing in power. And the game will pretty much be as easy as a nightmare run can get. This ability is another tool, so it will not cost us momentum, and instead it will be generating it for our Lightning Flask. It's also on a very short cooldown, so it will generate momentum quite often. Explosive Trap is another ability that sends enemies flying, so it's kinda cool that we can do that twice now. And it also deals very good damage, is a decent area of effect, and can again detonate more overwhelms. Here is what the skill tree should look like at level 30. Let's quick talk about a few of the most important passives when playing this build. Riposte, the first ability you get. This is extremely powerful in the early game. Learning how to parry early can make you pretty much invincible in the early game along with the invincible late game. But be warned, parrying is hard in this game on Nightmare as a rogue. You absolutely do not need to know how to use this. I personally rarely did myself. However, it's a very strong tool if you're able to master it. Next up is Rolling Momentum. Because we have two tool abilities in the early game and only one that uses momentum, we can pretty much always use Lightning Flask thanks to this passive. This passive giving us momentum allows us to loop our abilities almost every time they come up, which not only leads to making us much stronger, but it's also just fun to spam abilities. Momentum generation in the early game for Rogue is a little bit slow, so this is an amazing passive. Now let's also talk about some motivation quick. There isn't really anything you need to know how to do with it because it works for you, but this passive is still nuts. 4% damage boost for every arrow is actually insane, and the entire reason we pick the bow that we do is to boost this damage even more. By the end of the game, we're getting almost 70% damage boost for just picking this passive. Downfall is incredibly important for Rogue early. Use this passive and use it often. Very, very often. If an enemy is knocked down, which they will be from lightning flasks, bombs, and other random reasons, then jump heavy them. It's a guaranteed critical. And don't just do it once, do it over and over and over again until they get up. It's a very significant damage boost. Lastly is Adrenaline. This passive just gives us bonus damage for not getting hit. I'm sure you already weren't planning on getting hit anyway, but just know that when playing Rogue, the longer you go without being hit, the more damage you will have. As always with early equipment, just play the game, experiment, and try to enjoy yourself. There really isn't any significant piece of equipment that's going to win the game for you, or anything, so just slap together some items with good stats. After level 20, we will be acquiring the Duelist specialization and becoming an invincible juggernaut with the use of 1000 cuts. After you get this spell, you are officially one very large step closer to face rolling the rest of the game. 1000 cuts is the man. I personally think it's the best spell that rogues can get and the biggest reason you go the Duelist specialization. You will be using this spell pretty much 100% of the time once the build comes online. This ability's animation is ridiculously long and you are invulnerable when using abilities, so this is what leads you to not being able to die. It also deals a ton of damage. Swap out your lightning flask for this ability so you can still just have one momentum based ability. Next up, we will be keeping Explosive Trap for the entire game. This ability is just very good, and again, having two tool abilities feeding into your main ability is very strong. This allows us to still have an overwhelm detonation and knock enemies off edges, and we have good AoE. We love Explosive Trap. Lastly, we will be acquiring Reeling Bolt. You won't get this ability until later on, and it may seem like an odd choice for this build, but really the entire build is about supporting 1000 cuts, and this spell does it very, very well. It's still a tool ability and it also applies Weaken, which are great uses in themselves. But the real reason we get the spell is because it pulls in and groups enemies up for us to stab the entire group of them instead of just one of them. 1000 cuts can stab multiple enemies at once, and this ability helps support that significantly. It also obviously pairs very well with our actual AoE ability in Explosive Trap. When I was making this build, this ability wasn't really even in consideration at first, but it surprised me, and it's very easily the best third ability you can do, as you only need 1000 cuts for damage. It's also honestly just an incredibly fun ability to have. For ultimate, honestly, it really does not matter. Both ultimates are what I would say are not good, so use whatever one you like more. Both of them are less damage than just using 1000 cuts. Time to go over some of the important passives in the endgame. Daring Counter gives us deflect after killing an enemy with a strike ability. So seeing as how everything we kill will be from a strike ability with 1000 cuts, this just gives us an extra cushion of defense if something goes wrong, making you even harder to kill. The second one I want to talk about is Physical Strikes. You might wonder why would you want to grab this when all it does is change your 1000 cuts to physical with this build. But the reasoning is that necrotic damage in this game is just weak. The majority of the enemies are darkspawn in this game and they are resistant to necrotic damage. So I prefer making it physical, as then it's just good for every situation. Now, on the other hand, it is highly effective against Antom, who are the other major enemy type. So if you really want to min-max the game, then you can turn it off and on depending on the enemy type you're primarily facing. But if you don't really care, just keeping the passive on will be the better option. Now let's talk about the arsenal of choice. The weapons we'll be using are the Cutthroat Sword, Duelist Blade, and Grip and Rip. Cutthroat Sword is fantastic. It has high base damage, gives us more critical damage, big time penetration, and an easier way to access the precision advantage. Duelist Blade is pretty much just the most raw damage possible for this build, in the secondary weapon slot, and it also synergizes well enough with our necrotic damage. If you'd like, you could probably pretty easily change this with a blade of your choosing, like for example, the Cold Steel, that I used in my Frostfang build, effectively turning this build into just a better version of that one. The bow we will be using in this build is the Grip and Rip. I love this bow a lot, it's incredibly solid in every rogue build, and it's very fun. The reason it's so great with this build is that we won't be using our bow much, so it giving us 7 extra arrows is just 28% more damage from the Some Motivation passive. It also probably has the highest burst damage of all the bows when used in hipfire, which is what we will be using our bow for nearly 100% of the time. We do not need to be precise with our arrows, so just dumping as many of them as possible is higher damage for this build. This bow is a unique and it's acquired from the Fang Scorcher's lair. The helmet we're going with is Defiant Silence. Not a whole lot to say about it, it's just a ton of extra critical damage, which is what the build is all about. The armor of choice is the Garb of Kinship. I've talked about this at the beginning of the video and other builds. This armor piece, in combination with Maw of the Black City, is utterly broken. Not only does this armor piece completely offset the negatives of Maw of the Black City by healing us a ton, but it also is one of, if not the highest damaging armor pieces you could have. It's extremely easy to get advantages in this game, so it's very much not uncommon for Garb of Kinship to be giving us a 30 to 40% damage boost almost all of the time, even going higher than that in some occasions. The amulet is the Crow's Perch Medallion. In combination with 1000 Cuts, this amulet is just broken. Giving you momentum for critical striking with 1000 Cuts is just incredible, as we will be doing that every time. It also boosts 1000 Cuts damage significantly. Just a great choice all around. The rings are Maw of the Black City and Bleeding Corvus. As I'm sure we are all well aware of by now, Maw of the Black City is busted and enables absolutely degenerate gameplay. Don't get me wrong, this isn't an attack on degenerate gameplay, it's just broken. I would personally never advocate for nerfs in a single player game, so hopefully it sticks around. Maw of the Black City's downsides of hurting yourself are completely erased by Garb of Kinship and the belt Twin Buckle Binding. So really, you're just getting free damage with this ring, and proccing a lot of passives that rely on critical hits. This unique ring is easily acquired from the tree in the snowy area of the crossroads after killing 50 Darkspawn in the area. Just leave and come back to spawn more of them in order to reach the number needed. The Bleeding Corvus boosts our physical damage significantly, and because we changed our main ability, 1000 Cuts, into physical, it pumps that damage up even more. Alongside our other ability, Explosive Trap. If you do decide to switch between necrotic and physical depending on enemy, switch this ring out for a necrotic one when using necrotic 1000 Cuts. Lastly for rings, I want to give you guys one more insane option. You can use the Last Resort in this build. You really don't take damage from anything else, so if you want to kill yourself to deal extreme amounts of damage, then feel free. I would not advise using it with Maw of the Black City because you'll eventually do so much damage to yourself that it's going to be really hard to fight through. But you could swap it out for Maw of the Black City if you just want to change it up a little bit. Our belt will be the Twin Buckle Binding. Belts are not really that powerful in this game, especially when you don't need the healing very much, so we are opting for the one that gives us a little bit of extra damage, and also helps offset Maw of the Black City's self-damage. The runes for this build are Pierce, Redouble, and Ascend. Pierce is one of the best passive actives as it gives us a huge penetration boost for tanky enemies. Redouble is simply used for the bonus ability damage passive, and Ascend is also used for its passive damage boost. However, if you are feeling risky, you definitely can use Ascend, because for the most part, you're going to be invincible anyway. The endgame playstyle for this is really to just press your 1000 Cuts button over and over and over again, stabbing them 1000 times and being invincible, but if you want some nuance, then also use Reeling Bolt to group them up and prime them for a teammate detonation and easy AoE damage. Use Explosive Trap after pulling them together if you want, or use it if you need momentum or to send enemies off ledges. Spam your bow hipfire when running towards ranged opponents, and that's really it. It's an extremely powerful build the entire game, and one of the best you could possibly play in the entire game. For companions, I like Emmerich for his necrotic invulnerability he provides, his healing, and his overall utility. I think mages in general are the best companions to have. As far as the other companions go, I like to have a weaken to detonate my Reeling Bolt for big AoE damage. So naturally, that leads us to our guy, Davrin. He also comes with a nice taunt and a cool Griffin pet, so now we both get Manfred and Asan on our side. The Dream Team. As a reminder, there is a link in the description to a full level by level guide. Let me know what you think about the build in the comments down below, and please click the like button if this video was helpful. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.